Hello and welcome to my presentation on behaviourism. My name is Jacob Bodner. Today I'll be talking about behaviourist learning theories, including classical and operant conditioning, as well as their strengths and limitations of behaviourist learning theories and the applications of behaviourist learning theories in the classroom, finishing with some conclusions. But first, let me introduce you to Chaz. Chaz is my cat. He has developed a habit of jumping up onto the bookshelf in the middle of the night and knocking things off to get our attention, to wake us up. He does this because he's hungry and he knows that by doing this he'll get fed. Now, behaviour and behaviourism. Behaviour has been described as the actions or activities of an organism that are observable and measurable. Behaviourism is the explanations of learning and behaviour explained in the context of a stimulus-response relationship. This follows the cause and effect mechanism, which is the underlying principle of behaviourist theory. It involves contiguity, that is, the association of a stimulus with a response, or the SR model. A stimulus is an event that activates the senses and influences a behaviour, and the response is an observable reaction or behaviour to the stimulus. Classical conditioning attempts to explain behaviour that is involuntary and automatic response to the environmental stimuli. It was first described by Ivan Pavlov, who studied the relationship between a dog being fed and the dog's salivation and digestion. He did this by introducing a neutral stimulus, that is, the tuning fork, to an unconditioned stimulus, the food, which led to an unconditioned response, the salivation. Now, afterwards, the tuning fork became the conditioned stimulus because the dog associated it with being fed, and when hearing the sound of the tuning fork, it salivated, which turned into a conditioned response. He was able to generalize the response by teaching dogs to respond to a range of notes from the tuning fork. Then he was able to discriminate the response by teaching dogs to respond to a single note out of a range of notes. Now, my cat Chaz knows that he'll only jump up onto the bookshelf in the middle of the night to get a response. He doesn't do this during the day when he's hungry at other times. Now, Pavlov was also able to extinguish the learnt behaviour, that is, extinction, after repeatedly presenting the conditioned stimulus, that's the tuning fork, without producing the food. I've yet been unsuccessful in doing this with my cat. Pavlov's work was further developed by John B. Watson in his experiment with little Albert, where an infant boy had been conditioned to be fearful of a white rat. Now, in operant conditioning, it attempts to explain the behaviour that is voluntary, conscious, and intentional. This involves the use of positive and or negative consequences to strengthen or weaken the behaviour. The work of Thorndike and Skinner on animals including cats, rats, and pigeons found that learning was a result of trial and error. The learnt behaviours are reinforced by positive and or negative consequences, that's reward or punishment. Now, the applied behaviour analysis, or ABA, is the application of the principles of operant conditioning to change behaviours in settings such as schools. Behaviours do not occur in isolation but are part of a chain of actions, stimuli, and reactions, or responses. The displayed behaviours are a result of an array of numerous ongoing events that involve other people and the person's environment around them, such as their family and friends and teachers, as well as in their school or home environment. Behaviours are controlled by antecedents and consequences, that is, the antecedent behaviour consequence model, or ABC. Now, the strengths of classical and operant conditioning are that it's useful in explaining automatic responses, and they can be used to reduce fearful or irrational behaviours in children and adults, such as phobias, by therapists. And there are many classroom-based applications on effectively teaching new skills and behaviours, especially to young children and those with intellectual disabilities or behavioural problems. And it also includes strategies to reinforce positive behaviours and reduce negative behaviours. Examples of these are students knowing to put their hand up when they would like to speak, or students knowing that there are consequences to not doing their homework, such as detention. Now, the limitations of classical and operant conditioning are that they only describe behaviors which are observable and measurable, and they reject the contribution of cognition to the learning process, especially for more complex forms of behavior such as problem solving. They also create a dependence on extrinsic reinforcement rather than intrinsic motivators. Now, then comes social learning theory, which attempts to explain more complex human behavioral patterns such as problem solving, kindness, and aggression. It was developed by Albert Bandura as a way of recognizing the contribution of cognitive factors to learning, proposed by Piaget. It demonstrated that behaviors could also be learned through observation of model behavior without the presence of reinforcers. And he found that behavior is the product of the complementary interaction between internal influences such as cognition with external environmental factors of the learner. In conclusion, I feel that understanding the role of classical and operant conditioning is important, and it has a place in explaining and teaching behaviors to students. However, they should not be used solely to explain human behavior, and it's important to understand the role of cognitivism and constructivism and humanism in developing behaviors in children. I feel also that it is imperative that positive behaviors are modeled to reduce the reliance on extrinsic motivators.